Hey there, good afternoon. What day is it? Thursday? Yeah, it's Thursday. So, this is day 3 of story time. I am reading my grandma's book, He Whistles for the Cricket. Today we're on chapter 4. You can find chapters 1 and chapter 1 and chapters 2 and 3 on my Facebook page. They'll stay up in case you miss a day or two. And I will be taking Saturdays and Sundays off, so I am just reading Monday through Friday at 2:30 p.m. Central Time. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that you are enjoying the story. I enjoy reading the story. I hope you all are doing well today. We have sunshine, and the weather's gotten a little warmer here, so that's nice. Yesterday it rained all day long, so we were a little stuck inside. But my sister, who is a singer-songwriter, her name is Brittany Jean, and you can find her all the places, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. She's got a website, bjeanmusic.com, or bjeanmusic is her handle everywhere. She is releasing her 4th album, and she just announced today that the release date is April 16th, and since this is my feed and I can do what I want, I'm giving her a plug. I already have the CD, and it's amazing, and I love it, and I've already listened to it like 3 or 4 times, and last night we took the kids out for a drive, and we just drove around and listened to the music, because sometimes it's just nice to listen to music in your car where you can't really do anything else. So, anyway, here we are for He Whistles for the Cricket, Chapter 4. I hope you all are doing well. I hope that you have nice weather wherever you are, and that you're healthy and your friends and family are healthy. And if you need a distraction or an escape, or you feel like you know people who would enjoy this story, hey, let them know that I'm over here doing this every day, except weekends, not Saturdays and Sundays. I know Saturdays and Sundays probably aren't as different from the rest of the week as they usually are, but I'm still taking them off. Hi, Uncle Nolan and Aunt Jan from Virginia. Thanks for joining me. All right, let's dive in. I don't know why, but I feel like I'm getting more nervous as I'm doing this every day, even though I should be getting less nervous because, I don't know, Anyway. Chapter 4. Provoke not your children to wrath, lest they be discouraged. Greg came home after Queenie's body had been discovered. Tom, with remarkable wisdom, had taken her heavy body out of sight, half carrying, half dragging her to the slope behind the henhouse. There he covered her with an old tarp taken from the barn. The pup, who had not left his mother's still body, followed him as he put Queenie's body down and stood there looking at him sorrowfully. Tom didn't quite know what to do with him, but he had the sense to know where he would be well cared for until things settled down. He felt bad for Queenie, but more than just about her death. He sensed the anger and turmoil that would follow. He knew his dad pretty well, and he, like Greg, sensed that the liniment egg, which Greg had told him about, had done this. He carried the pup across the yard to Miriam's house, and when she came to the door, he asked her if she would take care of him for a while. Then he told her about Queenie. Miriam hadn't known she could feel so sad. She wondered if you could ever be filled up with so much sadness that no more could fit. Once again, it was the living pup which drew her focus. This was how her mother must have felt over Buffy, only Buffy had been her own. Even so, she and Queenie had been such special friends. They mattered to each other. She hugged Queenie's pup. She rocked him as she went slowly back and forth, wanting to be able to claim this pup for her very own now. She knew he was not hers, and that she could not have him. But when he belonged to Queenie in the special way she had participated in, it hadn't mattered so much. But now it did. So very much. She had often recently sensed a wistfulness in her mother, wanting to offer the pup to Miriam. But the offer just wasn't forthcoming. Miriam knew it was not just something her parents hadn't thought about, and so she had not asked again. "Hi, Mom!" Mr. Johnson lambasted Greg at the door of the barn. His words cut like a whip across the boy's already bruised consciousness. Mr. Johnson just didn't stop. He told Greg that he was not fit to own a dog. The liniment bottle had contained cow vaccine, and he ought to have checked. The cow vaccine cost a mint, and a little too much would kill a cow, let alone a dog. Why, he blasted out again, hadn't Greg asked? Dumb fool boy. Good dog like that, gone in a day. Pups, too. Where was his head? Greg stood mute, planted to the barn floor. He'd not learned verbal retort. His guilt-heavy conscience retreated, and he stiffened to the whiplash of words heaped upon his 13-year-old attention. He met the charges in frozen subjection. The charges confirmed what he already knew. Somewhere in the tirade, Mr. Johnson crossed that point of cruel tutelage, and Greg toughed inside to the scourge. It didn't matter what more was said then. The barrage of words fell on insensitive ears, for Greg had withdrawn. Mr. Johnson must have sensed the withdrawal, and he too withdrew, spent. Tom stood, trying not to be noticed. He wanted to help Greg, that's all, just help Greg. Mr. Johnson caught Tom's eye, but turned away toward the house without acknowledging him. However, in a moment, he turned back to Tom and said, "Get rid of that pup. It ain't safe around here." Greg went to the corner of the barn and slumped to the ground. "Greg," Tom began, but he couldn't find anything to finish with, so he puttered around the barn a minute, then left. He walked over to Miriam's house to tell her she could have the pup if she wanted. He didn't want to go home for a while. Segue. Miriam rode silently in the back of the truck, holding the pup. She knew every tree along this well-traveled route, and when she saw the big white farmhouse on the left, she called out, "Stop here, will you, Jeff?" Jeff looked back at her in surprise. "Sure. Cheney's?" he asked. She nodded. "Will you pick me up on your way home?" He would, and so she climbed out with the pup. Jeff continued down the road to return the borrowed trailer. Mrs. Cheney came to the door, surprised and delighted with her early visitor. Miriam had told her about the day of the pup's birth and about the flood. Now she told her about Queenie and the liniment egg, and why she had the little pup with her now. "I never heard of liniment killing a dog," Mrs. Cheney said. "It must have been something else." She fixed Miriam a cup of hot chocolate and held the pup while she drank it. The white kitten had run of the Cheney farmhouse, and she spat in miniature feline imperiousness at the furry black visitor who surveyed the kitchen and the kitten from his lap vantage point. Miriam laughed at the two of them. Being with Mrs. Cheney and telling her made things seem normal again. "Well," Mrs. Cheney took charge when she had heard the whole story. "That pup could still use some mothering. What we can do is see if Missy will wet nurse him. You never can tell unless you try." She smiled at Miriam and encouraged her. Then she led the way to the barn where Missy sunned with her latest litter of pups. Mrs. Cheney herself had an authority about her that ensured the safety of the pup in her presence. She set him down a few yards from Missy and coaxed invitingly. "Look at this, miss. A poor little orphan who needs mothering. Want the job?" Missy ventured over in appreciation of the gentle overtures, and she gave Miriam a good welcome, sniffing against her outstretched hand as Queenie so often had. This was her "welcome, friend." But when she took full notice of the pup, the hair on her neck rose, and her low growl froze the pup in his wriggling anticipation of the mother affection he had never before been denied. "Missy, stop that!" Mrs. Cheney was sharp, and Missy obeyed, at least the letter of the law. She eyed the pup threateningly and retreated to her litter. "It takes a little time," Mrs. Cheney told Miriam, who looked discouraged and a little frightened. "They have to make their own way, mostly." "But will she hurt him?" Miriam asked. "She might. That's why we'll watch a bit," Mrs. Cheney comforted. "She won't kill him, but she might abuse him. We'll just have to watch and see." The pup was more resilient than Miriam could have imagined. Brothers and sisters gone, mother gone, he wanted the family and the nurture this angry mother dog obviously had the ability to supply. He'd been nipped by his own mother before, sometimes angrily, when he himself had bitten her too sharply with his little white teeth. He'd been cuffed about in the general tussle of sibling rivalry, and didn't take it to heart too much. Missy's rebuff was just something to be borne and effectually gotten around. He arched back into a sitting position and barked a sharp little challenge. He wagged his furry whip of a tail. Missy growled again, but this time less threateningly. The pup closed in, but not for long. Missy sent him ki-ying backwards, snapping viciously. Mrs. Cheney put her hand on Miriam's knee when she started to go to his rescue. "No, Miriam. Missy has to let him know who's boss," she instructed. They continued to watch the little drama. Again and again the pup made attempt to join the litter, and was snapped or growled into retreat. But Missy's growls became warning barks, less dangerous, and her snaps became nip-like gestures. After some time, the pup was exhausted and lay in the grass, head on outstretched front paws. Missy's pups came over, one at a time, and sniffed the now silent pup. Then, after what seemed a very long time to Miriam in the late afternoon sun, Missy lay stretched on the grass. It was her lunch invitation to her litter. Slowly, the afternoon pup, less naive than the morning pup, questioned his way to the mother dog. He moved in, tentatively, to nurse. Missy, for all her previous challenge, ignored the intrusion, averting her eyes in maternal acquiescence. The foundling pup nursed and slept once again, accepting the natural graces of life in a new and subdued humility. Mrs. Cheney put her arm around Miriam, who turned and hugged her quickly, and ran to the honk of the car. Jeff was back, and she was so glad for the pup's acceptance by Missy that her natural buoyancy returned. "Oh, thank you, Mrs. Cheney," she called from the truck. Jeff wondered, as she settled beside him, if there might not be more going on inside this little sister of his than he knew about. She sure seemed to be involved in a lot more than paper dolls this year. "That's quite a little girl," Mrs. Cheney told her husband that night. She told him about the pup and all that had happened. "She reminds me so much of Sarah. Her folks can't afford the expense of a pet for her, but if ever a child would do well by an animal, that one would." Mr. Cheney suggested, "Well, we have plenty to share. Seems to me you could use a little help over here a couple of hours a day. That way she could see the pup and help you. Earn a little money, too." Mrs. Cheney liked the idea. In fact, she liked it so much that she drove straight over to see Miriam's parents. They had a good talk. Mrs. Cheney had a way of approaching things that made everything seem to fit right in. That night, Mrs. Green asked, "Miriam, would you like to do some work for Mrs. Cheney? She'd like you on a regular basis, and we could pick you up on our way home from work." Miriam couldn't believe it. "Mom, do you mean it? Me? She wants me to work for her? I could do it." Of course, at that point, it didn't matter if the Cheneys had wanted her to move pianos or paint barns. She was certain she could do it. She could work hard. In fact, she would work double hard for Mrs. Cheney. Mrs. Cheney was a good woman. She was a good woman, Mom, and she would do right by her. Jeff took all this in and was patronizingly amused at the enthusiasm of his little sister for a work offer. "Mom, I'd do a good job. I know I would," Miriam continued. "Why, Miriam, you don't have to convince me, and you sure don't need to convince yourself, evidently," Mrs. Green smiled. Mr. Green took this in and said, "Couldn't be that little black pup they have over there has anything to do with all this, could it?" Miriam looked surprised. "Dad, do you know about that little pup? Missy likes him just fine, and I would sure like to be able to see him, but I'd do a good job for Mrs. Cheney, no matter." "I know you would, Pumpkin." It was his pet name for her, and she knew then that he was supportive of the whole idea. Jeff even offered to drive her there on days when he could. Oh, she was grateful, but she could ride her bike. In the snow? Well, she hadn't thought of that. When would she start? Right away. Tomorrow, if that were possible. It was! The tomorrows came, and Miriam sorted beautiful woolen scraps and cut them into strips for a rug Mrs. Cheney planned on hooking in the long winter days. Miriam could learn how and help her. She put library books in alphabetical order and made a list of the authors and titles. She weeded the late autumn chrysanthemums in the flower garden. Mrs. Cheney taught her to use a saw-toothed knife for weeding. There was a long white picket fence which stretched from the Cheneys' driveway past the silos and the fresh-painted outbuilding that fronted the country road. Miriam had driven by so many times and had enjoyed the red and white petunias blossoming from late April all the way through October. She had watched them gradually grow and fill in the whole flower garden which edged this fence. In midsummer she had seen the tall, spiky red flowers appear behind the row of petunias, Her mother called them salvia. Creeping white alyssum laced the edges and got prettier and prettier as the weather got colder. The flowers were always there, right up until the first good frost, and the mums and alyssum lasted even after that. When November came, the fence posts would appear, what seemed to be almost magically, decorated with corn stalks tied in the middle, and Indian corn would be hung from each bundle. At the bottom of each corn stalk would be a bright golden-orange pumpkin. Miriam had loved the changing scenes. Mr. and Mrs. Green would slow the car as they drove by on the way to town to take in the meticulous artwork of the Cheney home, which graced the country road with such colorful satisfaction. Now, working for Mrs. Cheney, she was learning what labor went into the making of such a scene. Miriam worked her knife into the soil on cool autumn afternoons, and learned how much easier it was to work after a gentle fall of rain. She helped pick out the pumpkins, and she helped tie the cornstalks with long vines. And all the while the pup played alongside or under her feet, and she talked to him, telling him he was a scamp and a bother. He didn't believe her at all. Missy's pups were older than Miriam's, and were soon given away. But Mrs. Cheney kept the black pup, just for Miriam. Missy had assumed proprietorship, and it was as though the pup had been born to her, now that the others were gone. The bonds of adoption were strengthened with just the two of them. Missy was a smart dog, Mrs. Cheney had told Miriam. She had her own special chair she was allowed to sit in the sunroom off the parlor of the old farmhouse. She knew enough not to sit in any of the other furniture, but this one chair was given to her as her own. Once, Mrs. Cheney went on, Mr. Cheney sat in the chair to put his shoes on. Missy was fit to be tied, and he knew it, so he teased her by staying put. But rather than brood, she made a plan. She went to the door and barked to go out. Mr. Cheney laughed and got up to go to the door and open it for her. He figured he'd won that little contest. But no sooner had he gotten 2 feet away from the chair than Missy had circled around behind him and landed on it. If ever a dog could have chortled, Mrs. Cheney said, Missy would have. She didn't move from that chair all morning. The days were filled with hard work and puppy play. The pup greeted Miriam each day with a wild rush of welcome. He had the run of the kitchen and part of the house. During the stretches of time when she was in school or at home, he played with the white kitten, inside or out. Just as he had made his way into Missy's affections, so he had won over the kitten, who lay stomach up between his growing young legs. She would bat his face with her rounded paws gently at times, but sometimes with claws exposed. She would register a hit, and he would respond with a sniff or a little cry, withdrawing only for a second or two from the play. They grew up together into the winter months and extended their play to the hearth in front of the fireplace, with the energetic laziness of youthful leisure. Only the pup grew 4 inches to the kitten's 1. Some mornings, as they wrestled together, Mrs. Cheney would find the kitten soaked from the pup's mouthing her. She feels like a wet sock, Mrs. Cheney would tell Mr. Cheney. He gets her whole head in his mouth. Mrs. Cheney was well aware of the bond of love between Miriam and the pup. She longed to do something more about this good thing she was being allowed to observe. She found her opportunity through the kitten her son had entrusted to her keeping. Occasionally the pup had to be rebuked because the play got too rough. The kitten had to be rescued more and more frequently as the pup got bigger and stronger. Once, Mrs. Cheney thought the little kitten's neck had been snapped. There had been an awful cry, and she saw the kitten fly up into the air. The pup looked gleeful, waiting for the kitten to come down so they could resume their play. The kitten most surely did come down, but in no condition to play. It lay still, and Mrs. Cheney ran, scolding the pup and frightened for the kitten. The toss had stunned the little puddle of soggy white and black fur, and that was all. But it was enough to cause Mrs. Cheney to think seriously about the pup and his future with them. Besides, she had long been working on how she could help Miriam. Mrs. Cheney understood animals and the way they were. But this kitten was under her special protection, and so she necessarily favored it. She started for the phone thoughtfully, and then remembered again that the Greens didn't have one. Instead, then, she drove over to have a talk with them. Before she had come up with a working arrangement. This time she would go talk to them about a boarding arrangement. She prayed as she drove for wisdom, and the Lord had ample provision. That afternoon, when Miriam walked over after school to begin her work, Mrs. Cheney met her out in the yard. The pup was with her, and she received her usual lively greeting. It was so good to be so very special to someone. Mrs. Cheney said, "Miriam, I have an offer for you. I've already talked it over with your folks, and it's fine with them if you want to do it." Miriam looked up at her in question, and so Mrs. Cheney continued, "The pup has had his shots. He has his tag. He's in fine shape. Trouble is, he's too rough on our kitten. Fact of the matter is, I thought she was a goner today." Miriam took in her breath and looked down at the pup in dismay. But Mrs. Cheney put forth her hand to Miriam's shoulder in quick reassurance. "Everything's fine, just that the pup almost snapped her neck today in their wrestling." "Oh, Mrs. Cheney, do you think he's mean?" Miriam was fearful. She knew a mean dog was not to be tolerated, and she had to ask the question. "No," Mrs. Cheney said thoughtfully. "That pup's not got a mean bone in his body. But when two young animals play, the littler one has to set the limits in his own defense. Kitty hasn't done that. See, that's why I need you. I'd like to place this pup in your keeping, if you will. Your folks have agreed. If he gets sick or needs care, you just bring him on back and we'll take care of him. I'll add $1 a week to your wages for caring for him for me. It's just that it can't be around here. What do you think, Miriam?" How could Miriam say what she thought? A gladness welled up in her that came with tears just spilling over. And adding to her helpless confusion of gratitude. She did not think to question why in the world Mrs. Cheney would want to board out a pup she had only taken in to be a help to someone else. She did not know how to adequately communicate her love and thanks, and so she just nodded her head up and down while the tears splashed down her cheeks. She wanted to run and holler and race with the pup all the 4 miles to home. Mrs. Cheney seemed possessed of an uncanny perceptiveness, which told her things like that, and so she said, "Run on home with him now, Miriam, if you want to." Miriam looked up and felt desperately that she had to find some trickle of a way to express her heart. She found it in a simple supplication. "Would you name him for me first, please, Mrs. Cheney?" Mrs. Cheney answered, realizing the honor bestowed in the simple question, in a choked voice. "Why, child, there's never been any question in my mind. This little fellow has been through some pretty rough waters with you. I'm certain the Lord would understand. His name ought to be Moses." And that's the end of chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed that. And we'll read some more tomorrow, and then we'll take a break for Saturday and Sunday. And, yeah, that's just what that story does to me. So, the words got really blurry there at the end, and I was having a hard time reading. So, yeah. Anyway, thanks for joining me, and I will see you. Well, I won't see you. I'll just be here by myself as usual, but you will see me tomorrow